for the architecture.
Oh, that's better.
Address some of the challenges. Got quite a lot of my own. Thinking about ID. So start. We done, but it did show that what we've done was a great success. So before I go on, I want to talk a bit about the structure that we now kind of run under in terms of the systems, but also in terms of our teams. So our digital platform is largely obviously based on the left-hand side. We've got the very fairly obvious inputs into our systems: iOS, Android, web. As I said, mobile is now a vast part of our story and where a lot of our effort goes. Sitting behind that are 4 key domains, and within those we're split into platforms. And those platforms deliver a series of services, microservices. They're largely re-architected with Microservice Architecture. We're not quite there yet. We're probably 70-80% re-architected. Over the next year or so, we'll be fully there. But the vast majority in that state. At the other end of the scale, we've got some of the more enterprise-type platforms, and some of these are things like SaaS offerings, some of our big-scale applications. So we've got our Oracles in here, Dynamics, those kind of things sitting at the other end. They're integrated back into our platforms by use of an integration platform. We use Mule ESB as our tooling of choice. And again, they will then be used to integrate back into our services. And obviously, we've got a separate data platform that underpins all of this. Data is becoming a massive thing for us, as it is for many organisations now, and it's one of the big changes over the next couple of years for us. To support that, we run a platform model, and I'll talk a bit more about this as we go along. We used to be project teams, we've now migrated to platform teams. And the way that looks like, so they're organised into domains. A platform team then has an amalgamation of business and IT people in there to help manage things like the backlog that could overload priorities. And there's one or many development teams, generally many development teams underpinning that. And that team is a fairly standard agile team, a kind of 6 plus or minus 3 type model. Supporting that, we have the competency function, which I'm a member of engineers, architects, business analysts, QAs, platform engineering, which I run, which will then support these as a horizontal across those teams. So let's just give you a flavour of what it looks like. So when I talk about later on, you've got a bit of a context to what we're going to come into. So now we've talked about where we are, I'm going to flip back a bit, back to 2008. So these are kind of figures of where we were. This shows you obviously some of our stratospheric growth. Obviously, we've just finished our financial year, our 2017 financial year. We run to the end of August. So we haven't got those figures yet, but we're guessing they're going to be around the 2 billion mark. So we're still significantly growing. We haven't stopped yet. So since I joined 8 years ago, financially we've grown about 20 times in 8 years. And then we had a monolithic legacy platform. It's what ASOS was built on. It got us through about the first 8-9 years of our life and was very successful. However, it wasn't going to meet our needs. It was very tightly coupled code, very low levels of testability. Extensibility was very difficult. We couldn't keep up with our growth rates. As we could see our velocity of development increasing, it was going to get it harder and harder to make changes. We're spending more time just on resolving tech debt than delivering features. It was all deployed in a single data centre and was very targeted at a UK-centric audience, which was becoming less and less what we were coming as a company. And back in 2008, the process of deployment was very semi-automated at best. There's a few of us here around that time. It was very, very semi-auto at best. It was kind of PowerShell and some orchestrated scripts to get stuff out to production. But it was all then delivered manually via a central DevOps team. So why do we need to re-architect? I've touched on some of the points already, but we had a very big technological constraint. It was this monolithic application. It was very slow to change. When I first joined, we managed a whole 12 releases that year, which were the most 12 painful releases of my life. Overnights going wrong, rollbacks, all that kind of beautiful stuff, which I'm sure you've all done. All the logic and presentation was intertwined. It was extremely unstable. It used to be the kind of joke that you used to try and leave at 4 o'clock on a Friday, because at 5 o'clock it would fall over. So everybody used to rush out the door as quick as they could. And to enable us to do a web experience and a mobile experience, we overlaid third-party proxies on top of the application, which just meant that everything just started getting slower and slower and slower. And it meant we were becoming more and more coupled into everything we did. So we knew we had to break some of these business constraints. We were still operating in a single language, which is also a constraint for us for a website that was trying to go across the world. Single currency, similarly, and single channel. We only operated through web natively. We're proxying up, but natively only through web. So what do we do about it? We developed something called the ALM v1. We were carrying out deployments in this semi-automated fashion, as I said. So we took a bit of a step back from that, and this was the first real step for ASOS on its DevOps journey. We addressed what we thought were the 2 key areas of pain for us at the time. At this time we were still in one data center. We were fully on-prem. So one of the big problems was around repeatable dev and test environments. It used to take us 2 months to manually spin up an environment on physical tin, and at the end of it, it was still rubbish. So we moved that into a private cloud. Now, it was still fairly manual, but we templated it, and we took that 2 months down to 2 weeks. So it was a big step forward for us. We only had about 6 teams at the time, So that kind of did the job for us, and it took us a significant step forward in terms of consistency of testing and that path to live journey. The second thing was a lack of repeatable deployment process. So we just started to build out a custom solution. And this was, we looked around at all the various offerings that were out there, but we decided to develop our own at the time. Going back 4 or 5 years ago, you did have obviously deployment tooling, things like Go and those kind of things, but they were quite expensive and they weren't really that configurable. They didn't quite meet the need of us as an organisation at the time. So we decided to develop our own. So it was a Saki and PowerShell-based solution. A few of the guys are here who were a key part of that development. And we still use it today, actually, in some of our functions. So that was the technology side. We then had to deliver this stuff still. So once we delivered this framework, we're now at a situation where teams now had an automated, repeatable process that they could deploy their code onto known environments regularly. So that was a massive step forward for us. And it really started to show benefits in terms of the quality of the code we're producing. We've embedded the concepts of some of the key concepts of DevOps within the teams now. They're starting to get the idea of the benefits of automation, and also starting to understand some of the cultural journey around why they had to do some of the things they had to do to get to live. It started better conversations with operations functions and started to break down some of those barriers. I suppose more importantly, it set the precedent with our business that it was beneficial and in fact necessary to invest quite heavily in this side of the operation. We could start to see we were making a step change in how we were functioning as an IT function. So what did it actually give us? Well, it gave us a hell of a lot, actually. In the 4 years from 2012 to 2015, we actually saw a 9-fold increase in releases to production in that time. So, by end of 2015, we were doing 332 releases to production. So before I go on, as a quick poll, who's doing over 300 releases to production now? So 2 people. So it's still not a bad number for us to do. We've got a long way to go in a minute, but that's where we got to. And now, that's a good number. If I said to most of you, do 300 releases to production, you'd probably be quite happy with that. But we could see that wasn't going to be enough for us. We understood that the centralized model we still had around DevOps could only take us so far. We're aware that even though it got us a long way and gave us that consistency that we needed with the teams to start off with, we needed to run a kind of a central mandate across all teams to kind of almost force them into a certain set of behaviour, move them in a certain way. That wasn't scalable, and it wasn't going to empower the teams going forwards. And we realised that the automation model we needed to do needed to become much more devolved. It needed to come into the hands of the teams so they could take it in the directions they needed to. The last thing was, the last thing to say to mention that, obviously at this time, we'd actually started our re-architecture into Azure at this time as well. So we're no longer just on-prem. We'd now started to release our code into Azure as well, across our new code base. I'll talk about a bit more about that now. So on that, around 2012, we also started the re-architecture of our code base. As I said, we've been in this monolithic environment, and we decided that wasn't going to scale for us. So we started to look at what that might look like. There was a lot of planning going on about how we might want to address this problem, and so they decided to go with a Microservice Architecture. And this happened largely from 2012 to 2015 majority, and we landed a lot of it towards the middle of 2016. And this was really important to us. And it was important to us for a whole multitude of reasons. So teams could now think about doing feature-based releases rather than project-based releases. It really started to change that mindset. They were largely no longer dependent on each other. Before we used to have to get 10 teams together to put one release out the door. Everyone was dependent on everybody else, and if one thing went wrong, the whole release got rolled back. Absolute nightmare. Now you've got a situation where teams are truly decoupled and can truly release independently. And putting those two things together made teams start to think that actually they now should release more regularly. It now became a reality of them. They didn't have to wait for anybody else. They had a smaller code base, so they weren't going to get the same issues that they'd had before. And now actually they were starting to think about releasing more regularly. And in fact, there's little benefit having that kind of architecture if you don't take advantage of that from a release perspective. And the move to Azure was huge. Suddenly, teams could now provision infrastructure and deploy code at will. with a lot less physical cost to them, and with a lot less constraints around how they had to operate with the operations function, for example. You no longer had to go and request a server, wait for someone to build it. That would take 6 weeks, then it would come back wrong, go and send it off again. All that stuff just disappeared almost overnight. Now, that had its costs as well. You've got to be clear about that, and it's one of the things which probably I'm going to be doing some future talks on, is around the operations side, and almost the fact that development kind of just went round operations because they no longer needed to use them. And it's been a challenge within the organisation now about how we make that conversation much more balanced between dev and ops within our organisation. The second really big thing that happened for us was the emergence of the platform teams. We realised that being in a project-based scenario just wasn't the right thing for us. Teams were delivering their projects, throwing them over the wall, and then moving on with the next piece of code. Now, as you start to bring that cadence up, and the organisation was scaling the number of teams and scaling the amount of work we've done, that just never is going to be sustainable. So we moved to a platform-based model. And that was significant for us because teams now had a long-term interest in the health of what they were delivering. They didn't just care about the code they were delivering, they cared about what it was living on for the first time. And they both needed and wanted to take on more responsibility across the code base. It was actually something that developers were asking for. It wasn't necessarily being pushed onto them. This is stuff that they actually felt that they should do. They should have access to production. They know best about their code. Why shouldn't they look after it? So actually they're starting to want to desire this. It meant that they understood their infrastructure from end to end in much more detail than they ever did before. And obviously having the Azure side of that really helped that conversation because they could start to guarantee that their infrastructure in dev and test was the same as production. And now that they've taken on both development and support responsibilities, they had the right motivation, I think, to think about the support aspects of what they were delivering. They were starting to think about monitoring and alerting in much more detail than they ever had before. They started to think about the speed of their pipelines more than they had before. Because they knew that they could be called at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's kind of in your self-interest to try and, you might not make that not happen, but if it does happen, to be able to resolve it as quickly as humanly possible. So it started to change the emphasis on how teams thought about what they did and how they did it. So the final kind of driver here was the business release demand. So ASOS is customer obsessed. It's one of the things that we believe differentiates us from much of our competition. We will do things that actively almost harm us as a company if we think it's the right thing to do for our customer. We'll actually do things that make us less profit if we feel it's the right thing to do for our customer long term. And that drives a lot of the way we think about how we release code and how we drive change within the business. But as we started to now unlock this potential that we realised by doing our re-architecture and by starting to release more, the business stepped it up a gear. They said, brilliant, you're not a blocker anymore. We want to release more features out to the customer now because we want to delight them even more. And the existence of a central deployment model, which we were still running, was seen as a key blocker to this now. We were going to start hitting that limit. That 330 was pretty much as high as we could do with the numbers we had. So, what do we do about it? We recognised that to fully support the goals of the business, we had to make some really key changes. The largest of which was to let go of central control of many of the things which we kind of held dear up to now. And I think they talked about that in the keynotes this morning. We kind of had to start being more of I kind of use the analogy of we will build the sandpit and then the teams could play in it in any way they like. Our job was to not come into the sandpit, our job was to find that outside sandpit. And so that's the way to start changing that mentality to. We had to start enabling the teams and looking at them to become more autonomous in everything we do. Autonomy is a big buzzword in ASOS at the moment, and we'll talk more about that later on. So what did that actually mean in practice? So we need to empower the teams to be able to do as much as they could on their own, whether that be creating environments, handling their own releases, being able to release on demand, but also being able to hook up to monitoring and solutions really, really quickly, and having good support for those when they did need to do them. So we wanted them to be able to do all this stuff at very low cost, very low friction. We need to improve team competency. So our goal is to make these teams as self-sufficient as possible. If you work for me, then part of the job description of a platform engineer, which is what we call DevOps in the organisation, is part of the job description is your job is to put yourself out of a job. Your job is to really work with the teams to get them to a level where you just sit back in the afternoon drinking pina coladas and watching them be awesome. But we're not there yet. But many teams think they can just do this. They say, oh, we can do DevOps, in just the same way they say, oh, we can do Agile. But actually, they don't really know what it means to really do that and drive that through. And so what we need to do is give them support and guidance over a long period to nurture them and move them in the right direction. And we need to get support much, much closer to the teams. We can't just be a competency. Platform engineering at ASOS is a mixture of doing and guiding mentoring. Depending on which team, depends on how much of the ratio you're working on those things. But we actively have to get in there. We have to physically build out pipelines. We help them with getting their code into live, sorting out their problems, all the kind of stuff that you really need to do day to day to really make sure the team's successful. And we need to support cloud deployment. Now, I call this out as a separate thing because even though ASOS has now been in the cloud for several years, we still had two things happening. We still had teams coming into it for the first time. Teams were now re-architecting their code a bit slower than some of the others, so they were still on-prem and they're now coming out. But more importantly, we all know the speed of Azure. I think they release a feature once every 2 days on average, something like that. So, there's always something new in Azure that someone isn't going to know about, there isn't a pipeline for, there isn't a strategy for. So, and one of the advantages of working in a company that like ASOS is we're a very fast adopter. If somebody can see a benefit of using a feature, then they're going to want to use it. We're not like a bank who we'll talk about it for a year or two until it's been bedded in and thought about. If we see it, then probably next week we're going to start using it. That's got pros and cons. It enables us to react to the business need very quickly and take advantage of the latest technology. On the downside, it means that potentially you've got a lack of control and governance, and you could end up with more problems than you generate. So we have to get there and support the teams in producing a kind of sustainable cloud journey as we go through. So how do we do that? So I think Jeffrey and Sam said this morning that DevOps is not about tooling, it's about culture and process, but tooling helps. And that was really key for us as an organisation. We picked VSTS, TeamCity and Octopus as our stack. And as I said, it's not the answer to what is a people and practices challenge. However, we used it as a reboot of DevOps in ASOS. The first framework we developed, the ALM V1 framework, it never quite realised the goals that we intended it to achieve. It never fully got to production. It still meant that the central DevOps function was still releasing this code. And teams saw that as a blocker. They saw it as a black box that was getting in their way. Whereas when we went to TeamCity and Octopus, a lot of people had come from other organisations who'd already used this tooling. It was kind of best-of-breed tooling. And they were much more open once you said, look, we're using tooling that you know and love. Actually, we now want to help you to improve. They were much more open to that conversation because they were working on tooling that they thought was good in the first place. And that was really critical for us in terms of the scaling that we wanted to bring it out. By now, we started to grow significantly. I talked about the fact there was a couple of teams right back at the start. By now, we were probably looking at about 30, 40 teams in the organisation. So you had to get a willing audience that was going to help drive this stuff through. So one of the key things that the tooling gave us for the first time was, say, this reliable and easy-to-use tooling. It really started to focus the teams on their development rather than their deployment. Before now, they used to spend, you spend an entire sprint, if not more, just trying to get their code out the door. Now they could change their emphasis almost overnight by putting stuff in pipelines and bring their stuff back much more down to the development side. And it also gave them those CI/CD pipelines for the first time. Our ALM framework, the first version, just didn't give us that. It didn't give us that CI/CD. So as a result, we just didn't get that continuity. We didn't get that speed all the way through. We didn't get the visibility all the way through. Now we had that pretty much out of the box. The rollout of the competency model was critical. If you remember the slide I showed you way back at the start around the platform model, there's a central competency function, which I'm part of. We needed to roll that out to support the teams. To work on each individual team and look at where they were weak, we had to try and focus that learning. So we have principal software engineers, lead QAs, lead DBAs, lead BAs. So wherever that team is particularly weak, we can help them. We can actually get in there and we can focus their learning and actually get them up to speed in the right way. Secondarily, we can also bubble up any problems that are enterprise level and solve them in consistently across the organisation. So that's been really key for us, and it's been something that we've put a lot of effort and focus on over the last couple of years, and it's really shown some real value. And jump quickly. Platform engineering. So say this is the function that I predominantly look after. We need to change the way we work. So I said right at the start of this slide, we need to think about how we let go of stuff. So as before, DevOps or ALM kept hold of everything. We were kind of owned the keys to the kingdom. It was our framework, and they worked the way we wanted them to. Now we wanted to really much to roll that out and really let the teams take ownership of this stuff. So even though we supplied them this tooling we wanted them to use, the teams at the Octopus, we wanted consistency across the organisation. How teams use that was then much more in their control. We really wanted them to be able to define their own destiny about how they would use that in the context of the tech stack that they were working in. So we still have a central DevOps function. It's a relatively strong function, and those guys look after the teams at the Octopus stack. They make sure it's upgraded, they make sure it's performant. They will look after the central competency, and they will support the guys in the teams. That's the role of the central function. So we run ourselves as a platform as well, in effect. However, where I spend where most of my team live is out in the teams. We run platform engineers, about 15 guys at the moment, working a ratio of roughly one platform engineer per 3 teams, and they will actually go and work out with teams, and they will actually build out their pipelines, but say more importantly, become that competency to the teams. They should be looking for the areas in which they can improve, and then helping those teams to improve and get better, so they can take on more and more of the responsibility themselves. Now, we deliberately don't have enough platform engineers for teams. We could just put one platform engineer in every team. What we've seen as that as a model is that then generally the team will just put all the platform engineering work onto that one person and say, you build out my pipelines, you fix my environments, you make sure it gets to live. It kind of doesn't focus the responsibilities well enough. If you have that ratio slightly wider, so one platform engineer can't physically do all the work, the team are forced to say, actually, can you show me how to do this? Can I have more responsibilities? Can I have more privileges to do this, please? And it forces that behaviour to start driving through. Now, it does cause bottlenecks. This is not a simple process. Teams have short-term deliverables they have to achieve, and therefore, there's always going to be those pressure points. And we will potentially drop extra people in from the central team to help that, but that's the model. We really want these teams to up the game themselves. So that's why we run the model we do. So I'm going to just briefly talk about one of our teams now to kind of try and bring that to life a little bit. So one of our key teams is the Orders platform. I talked a bit about them during the Black Friday. The Orders platform is probably one of the most critical platforms we have within the organisation. It takes the money. You can have a pretty website, but if you can't take the money, it's kind of pointless. So before they re-platformed, so back in 2015, as late as 2015, they were fully on-prem. All their infrastructure was in one data centre. All their deployments went through a centralised DevOps model. They weren't allowed to do anything themselves. It went through its ALM framework. They had no control over their own infrastructure. They weren't even allowed to log on to stuff. Everything had to go via our operations function. And their dev and test environments were woefully different to live. So they had real problems in making sure that things like performance, for example, was actually going to be representative when it went in. Oddly enough, the result of that was large, infrequent, painful releases. Often with which they'd have to do bug fixes off the back of it, and it was quite a painful experience all round. So they re-architected. They're one of the main areas that re-architected, and by August 2016, they'd landed the large part of their re-architecture. So now they're partially in Azure. They're not fully there yet. They've got some PCI elements of what they do, and some of their stuff hasn't moved yet, but they're now partially in Azure. However, they have got full control of both their Azure and the on-prem stuff. All of it is controlled through pipelines. All of it's configured and managed through DSC and ARM. And we've got a good monitoring stack that sits across it. We currently use Kibana across our stack, and that is now used to monitor those incidents as they go across. They've got full competency support. They've got a principal software engineer and platform engineer support associated with them, dedicated all the time. And these guys ensure that we do not compromise quality with the speed of delivery we do. So as a result, the quality of their code has come up significantly. We've migrated them across all to the Team City Octopus stack. So now they have full visibility of what they're producing. It's all through pipelines. So there's a consistent approach to any deployment they do. And their environments are much, much richer. Say on the Azure side, they are like for like. They are like for production, and they can manage those environments very, very closely in terms of spinning them up and spinning them down. And they can do lots of what-if type analysis and work out, if they're doing a feature change, what the impacts that will be with much more certainty. Results of that team actually managed to release daily. They don't do all the time, but they do manage to release daily. Their post-release issues have almost gone down to zero. And through logging and monitoring, they've actually got extremely better visibility of where they are. Massive success story. And we got stories like that across the whole organisation. Been working with our product team, and they've recently just done some work around their success story, and they managed to go from one release every 40 days to an average of one release every 2 days. And 3 weeks ago, released 5 releases in a day. So massively changed the way in which they're working and how they think about development and deployment. So that kind of leads into some of the did it work. So we're now seeing teams really taking ownership. They wanted to take on development of the pipelines themselves. We have constant conversations with platform engineers about, well, can I do this? How do I start to build these pipelines out? And we let the teams do that wherever we can. Teams are now actively involved in identifying and resolving issues and understanding those root causes. Whereas before, that used to be much more of an operations function. That's now moved right back into the platform teams themselves. There's been a vast reduction in release effort. So I just mentioned some of the figures around that side. Our release cadence has gone up significantly. We haven't increased the number of central platform engineers we've got actually releasing code, and our release volume's gone up massively, which I'll show you in a minute. And we're resolving challenges a lot quicker than we were before, and a lot earlier. By use of the pipelines, by use of reliable environments, we're actually spotting these things. We're doing the shift left. We're really identifying these things significantly earlier than we were before. We've still got challenges. You still get stuff going to production that shouldn't. I'm not going to say we're perfect by a long way, but the instances of that have come down massively. And teams are learning from those mistakes a lot more readily than they were before. And finally, we've moved on to much more better metrics-based discussions. Before, we didn't have particularly rich metrics around what we do. We used to kind of really use the number of releases as our holy grail. We've now got a much, much richer set of metrics, which I can get time, I can show you in a minute. But we've now got through Power BI, we've now surfaced, for example, all of the Octopus and Team City metrics. One of the great things is because they're both fully API-based, you can just jump in and suck out pretty much anything you like. So we could now got a whole plethora of data around our build and deployment pipelines that we can use for continuous deployment, continuous improvement across the organisation. And that really helps the teams to focus on what is important to them in terms of their next thing to improve. They're not shooting blind. They've now got some really good data to start working from. And going back to the Black Friday thing, the effort we put into DevOps over 2014 to 2016 meant that as an organisation, we actually successfully released every single piece of component we needed to do to get to that peak period, which meant that's why we had the successes we did. And that's really key. It's an organisation where we kind of live and die by our website. We only have a website. We have nothing else. And we work with a set of customers who are very fickle. 18 to 25-year-olds, if they get one bad experience, they'll spend their lives tweeting about it, and then they'll never come back to you again. So we have to really, really get a good experience consistently across that. And so that was absolutely key for us to deliver that. So this is kind of the punchline. This is, in a second. Oh, sorry, that's the last thing I was going to say. So the challenges. So that's all wonderful, but there's been some real challenges for doing this. Shifting accountability to the platforms was really challenging, really difficult for us. Actually getting teams wanted more responsibility. They want to get on the servers. They want to say, well, we know most about our code, so why shouldn't we look at it? And you go, yeah, absolutely. We're going to phone you at 3 o'clock in the morning. Okay. Not sure I want to do that. That bit was really quite hard to get them to understand the implications of what that meant. Once they got it, it's absolutely fine, but it took a while to get that across. Doing this at scale, we now run nearly 60 teams trying to implement change and continue to implement change because we've got a long way to go. When you're trying to operate at the scale we do, and we're still growing, we've got plans for nearly 80 teams, with the features they're delivering and trying to blend in the work we need to do to continually improve us, is a real challenge as an organisation. You can do this stuff when you're a startup with 2 or 3 teams, and you can play around with stuff, and you can just go, we'll try Git this week, or we'll try Jira or whatever. It's easy. When you're doing this at an enterprise level, it's quite hard to do. And as I say, the business demands are just getting more and more and more as an organisation. So we have to be able to justify why we want to do what we want to do and balance that against what the organisation, the wider organisation wants to do. So it's quite a challenge for us to achieve that. So the results. This is our releases. So that was our 332, 2015. So we started to roll out Team City Octopus during 2015. You can see the results. We just finished, say, our end of financial year, the end of August. We've managed to quadruple our releases in 2 years. And that, for me, is just the start. This is just on the basis of going to a microservice architecture, putting good platform engineering in place, and putting a really good deployment mechanism in place that teams can follow. From now on, it's about the teams taking advantage of that and really driving it forward as much as they can, largely themselves. They have to start to realise what it is to want to release on a regular basis. I say we have got some teams that are doing just about continuous deployment. We're definitely doing continuous delivery in a lot of places. We're not quite there on continuous deployment, but we have got some teams doing continuous deployment sporadically. If every team released one release per day, per working day, that number's 10,000. So we could easily hit 10,000 the next year or so. And that could go way beyond that. If you start to get in, release on commit, which is what we're starting to move ourselves towards, that number could be 20, 30, 40,000 very, very quickly. Yes?
Are you finding that your need for test environments is going down as your release cadence goes up because people are more confident in their releases?
Yes and no. Obviously, the fact that we've devolved into platforms which are now distinct from each other, that means obviously a lot of our testing effort has reduced because you've only got to test your bit of code and your immediate neighbours if you make a breaking change. So that's made a significantly improved situation in our testing. We still have some central test environments, but even those have actually reduced in their number and management, I suppose. So I think the answer is probably yes to that. We're doing a lot more, I almost class it like final testing much earlier in the cycle. Teams have got a much greater degree of confidence about whether it's going to work or not a lot earlier. It used to be the first time we really knew that was in pre-prod. Now we're doing it on day one of the development cycle. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's given the teams the kind of the virtuous feedback loop that they can do more and therefore they're going to release more.
And are you tracking the time between person starting and person typing git push production?
Not quite on that one yet. We're actually just trying to get some of that, and because we're going across multiple systems, we're trying to actually work out how to tie all that data together right now. It is definitely one of the metrics we're trying to do. I'm trying to get the 2 metrics. I'm trying to get the one from the point at which we put it into VSTS, i.e. full end-to-end time, but also the time from which I actually first check that into when it goes live. That's the 2 metrics we're really trying to get next. But so we've got to stitch together VSTS, Team City, and Octopus to really get those numbers. But that's something that I hope would be a really good number for us. So what's next for us? So the first one, as I said, was about autonomy. Autonomy is a huge thing for us as an organisation. It's probably depending on which side of the fence you're on, it's either a baseball bat or a swear word. Because we have teams go, look, we're autonomous, we can do what we like. We want to use a different deployment mechanism, we want to use different tests. I want to use Cake, I want to use Team City. All this kind of stuff going on. And it's difficult because platforms are funding themselves now. They are autonomous to a degree. They're responsible for their own infrastructure. They're responsible for the stuff they put out the door. However, as an organisation, we do want to keep some consistency across the piece. We want to be able to say, we want everyone to use .NET. We really want everyone to deploy by Team City Octopus. There's a real reason not to, because we get economies of scale from that approach. It also means that as people move between teams, there's no relearning that needs to happen. There's some consistency there. But we're going through the exercise right now to try and work out where the balance lies, and I think it'll be a different balance depending on what you're talking about. So that's an interesting one for us. Driving platform engineering to the team, so that's the real cultural side. Really need to get this embedded. I think we're still at the point where my platform engineers are still doing too much of the doing. We're not doing enough of the competency side. So we need to do more of that and be able to drive that into the organisation. I'd say continue the metrics-based conversations to help drive continuous improvement and actually give teams enough time to do continuous improvement. Unfortunately, again, we're being probably a bit too much feature-driven as an organisation, and we need to give our teams a bit more time to do the tech debt continuous improvement type work. And the key one for me is DevOps to Ops. So I think the one thing I feel that has been a pattern for what we've done is say, because we went to Azure, because teams could spin up their own infrastructure, because they could manage their own stuff, they did. So the ops function kind of got pushed to the side a little bit in terms of what their role used to be. Now, the ops function have massive value to what we do as an organisation. However, they're probably now not treated as in quite the kind of way that they need to be. That we're not using the value they have, and they're not being used as effectively as possible. You might argue you don't really need an ops function at the end of the curve, that actually a platform team can do everything. They can do the full end-to-end, and that's all you need. However, I think we're a way away from that, and we need to put baby steps. So I'm now working with the ops function to bring DevOps culture into the way that they work as well, so that they will use the same tooling, the same culture, the same approach as my team use, that the platform engineering team use, so that actually we just grow as a platform engineering function. And then we'll take that into database, and then we'll take that into security. So actually the whole, I'm kind of calling it shared services capability across an organisation, starts to work in the same way the platforms do, using the same tool set and the same approach and the same culture. So that if a team can't do something, that they've got someone working with them who has the same mindset and will solve that problem in the same way. And then eventually you might say, well, can you just merge those two together? But we've got a lot of work to do there. From a technology point of view, we've also got more automation to do. There's always more automation to do. We've got a lot to do around our underlying infrastructure and automating some of the base of that. We do a lot of work around data. We need to really sort out the data story across the organisation. Actually, some of the guys in the data stream actually are working with ASOS at the moment, and they'll talk about some of the challenges they have. But that's a key area for us. We need to be able to operate at scale, and what I mean by that is I need to operate at scale. I need to be able to cater for those 10,000, 20, 30, 40,000 releases we intend to do. I need to be ahead of the curve. We're already one of the biggest users of Octopus in the world, and we're working with them on the next version of the product to try and get scale for us. So we need to be well ahead of that curve, and we need to make sure the teams have got good information at their fingertips so they can make the right decisions. That's kind of it for me. Any questions?
What's the server footprint, number of servers that you guys need?
We've got kind of hard to answer that question. In terms of physical VMs, we're only running about 1,300, but we're predominantly PaaS. That's one of the reasons we went to Azure, because we prefer to use PaaS over IaaS. So we've got a significant PaaS farm. We're actually one of the biggest Azure spenders in Europe, just to give you an indication of the size of our operation. It makes us an interesting use case for Microsoft. But yeah, so we're large. I can't say exactly, but say we've got a vast number of PaaS. Any of my guys know the answer to that one? Loads. Too many.
How do you go about optimizing your cloud spend? Do you do it in terms of go and make things faster and costs will take care of themselves, or do you go out in terms of go and make costs go down and however that happens?
It's another really interesting area for us, because reality is we probably haven't got the control over spending quite the way I'd like, and unfortunately this has become my problem. Platforms are responsible for the budgets for Azure that they do. However, what they're currently doing is largely just understanding what their costs are. What I'm now trying to encourage them to do is actually actively bring those costs down to optimize them. So we're working to do that. Unfortunately, I think one of the challenges of Azure is they don't necessarily give you all the tooling to help you do that pretty effectively. So we've developed some of our own stuff in-house. We're looking at some third-party vendors. And we're trying to work through how we can make that information far more visible to teams. The one thing we're probably now really starting to drive on is that optimization piece. So it's really starting to understand what is the utilization of what we're actually using, and can we bring down the spec of the servers by increasing the density of what we're doing. The challenge we've got is we are still predominantly in V1 Azure. We were an early adopter of Azure, so most of our stuff is cloud services, and that means that it's not, you can't get the density. You can't really do everything you want to do with it. We're just starting to move into Azure Service Fabric, and that gives us much more opportunities to get much greater density across the spend we've got. But again, that's a migration we need to do.
I think we've got one more question. Anyone?
I'm around the rest of the day. If anybody's got any more questions, then feel free. Last thing I've got to say, because everyone says this at these things, we're recruiting. Because of the demand we've got across the teams, I am actively recruiting like 12 permanent staff at the moment. It is a fascinating company to work for. You will not do Azure at the kind of scale anywhere else, pretty much. The pace we're doing it at is phenomenal. I think it's a really interesting place to come and work. If anybody wants to come have a chat with me or any of my team, then feel free. Or go and look at the ASOS website. Thank you very much.